Welcome to this marvellous clipper, and thank you so much to Randstad for inviting us all here. You know, as Brian has said, there are some really interesting things happening to the labour market in the UK. And one of the complications I think we have when we look at that is to decide what part of it is about a recession and what part of it is about fundamental changes in the way that we're going to work over the next couple of decades. And I'd like this morning to suggest to you that what we're seeing now isn't simply a reflection of the recession, but we're in the midst of a sort of fundamental change in the way that people work. And, you know, I was in Singapore last week, and one of the guys there, some of you might know him, is a guy called Stephen Sidebottom, who's the head of human resources for Nomura, but is also a historian. And he and I were talking, and he said, you know, in the Industrial Revolution, if you look at how people described what was happening to them during the Industrial Revolution, nobody really understood the extent of change that was happening. You know, it's a bit like Charles Handy's. Do you remember Charles Handy's marvellous thing about the frogs? Do you remember that, the frog story? That if you, I'm sure it wasn't his story, but he made it his own, didn't he? The idea that if you put a frog, it's a rather horrible thing to do, I don't suggest you do it, but in cold water and heat it up very, very slowly, the frog gets so used to the water getting warmer that in the end it just sadly boils. Whereas if you sort of throw a frog into boiling water, it immediately jumps out. And in a sense, that's what's happening to us. You know, the truth is that what's happening to us, happening to our children, happening to our friends, happening to our corporations, is probably as great as anything that happened in the Industrial Revolution. But just as in 1820, when people talked about what they saw, they didn't describe it as something that was phenomenal, because it happened slowly. Now, actually, in a way, you may feel, well, our changes aren't happening that slowly, but in fact, they're happening relatively slowly. And when historians come to talk about the year 2010, as they will in 50 years' time, they will give this period a name. It hasn't been named yet. It never is at the time. But it will be a name that actually suggests that what we are experiencing, what our children are experiencing, what our young employees are experiencing is a fundamental change in the way that work gets done. And that's going to affect you. It's going to affect your employees. It's going to affect your children. It's going to affect, you know, people all around the world. And for me, that's the most interesting question there is right now. The most interesting question, in my view, in the world right now, in terms of our field, is what will the world look like in 2025? And that's the quest that I set myself to answer last year. And I was very pleased to have Randstad as one of our founding members of our consortium. We were joined by 29 other companies, and I'm happy to say we're relaunching the second phase of our research, in fact, in Singapore next week. And this time we have 40 companies from all over the world. And in fact, companies in Asia are so interested in the future of work, we've actually set up a hub of research both here in the UK and in Singapore. And the Singapore one is supported, in fact, by the Singaporean government. And we already have 15 Asian companies as a member of this conversation. So over the next year, we've built a worldwide portal that allows executives to talk about the future. And I'll be obviously commentating on that over the next year. What I want to draw your attention to is the fact that, in a sense, we're at a time of profound change. And what I'm going to talk about really is a global perspective. And I know for those of you who have organizations that are primarily UK focused, you may think, well, you know, what has that got to do with us? But actually the interesting thing about the future is even, you know, one of the groups that's joining us is the National Health Service, 1.5 million people here in the UK. And they may say, well, what's globalization got to do with us? Well, actually it's got a lot to do with everybody, even if they only have UK employees. And there's a sort of what I would call a configuration of 5 forces that are fundamentally going to change the way you work and the way that your organizations work. And in a sense, the one that we're most aware of is technology. You know, because all of us are sitting around with these amazing technological communication devices. And as I'm going to show in a moment, we were fortunate enough to have a whole bunch of technology companies advising us on the future of work. So we had Nokia, we had SAP, we've got Wipro in India, and they all say the same thing, that levels of connectivity are going to increase at a huge pace. And what that means is, simply put, by 2020, 5 billion people in the world, 5 billion people, will be connected to each other in a rather sophisticated way. And that, combined with the fact that by 2020, every book in the world will be digitalized. Those of you know that there's 2 or 3 major institutions, including Google, who are digitalizing the knowledge of the world. That will not simply be digitalized, it'll also be connected. So if you put together the idea of 5 billion people connected, plus the digitalization of the world's knowledge, that gets really interesting. And I want to say a little bit more about how I think that's going to develop. So first thing is technology. But, you know, related to that is globalization. You know, the fact is that more and more companies are both have their assets, their employees, and indeed their consumers outside their home territory. And that's growing at a phenomenal rate. You know, what we're seeing right around the world is the rise of the global organization. Interestingly, the companies that join us in the future of work this year from Singapore are companies like Singtel, Singapore Airlines, and they're there because they all have globalization aspects. And that means, for example, that those of you in banking will know that the most advanced bank in the world right now is not based in the US, it's not based in the UK, it's not NatWest, it's not Royal Bank of Scotland, it's a Kenyan bank who have actually used mobile phones to help people all over Africa make very small monetary transactions. And what that means is some of the best innovation in the world isn't coming from Silicon Valley. It's coming out of China, it's coming out of India. So we're seeing a phenomenal globalization of both innovation, which we always thought in the West was our job, and indeed an outsourcing, which is becoming ever more complex. Let me give you an example of that. When I was in Singapore last week, one of the guys I spoke with runs a big Philippine company. And this company in the Philippines does all the things you'd expect a company to do. But one thing they did, which I found so fascinating, I think you will, he says, you know, what's happening in the US right now is if you go and see your physician and they take an X-ray of you, they'll take an X-ray and at the same time they'll dictate something about your condition. He said in a huge number of cases now, that is instantly digitalized. It is sent to the Philippines, and physicians in the Philippines are looking at the X-rays, they're making their initial notes, they're making their diagnostic, and that is sent back to the States. So next morning, when you wake up, somebody around the world has already looked at your data. Now that's just a phenomenal story, and we're going to see more and more of the globalization of talent. And you know, the technology that pushes that is the fact that technology becomes not just ubiquitous, but also very low cost. And what that means is we're beginning to see the rise of the small global corporation. You know, in the past, corporations that were global were always big. But now, I mean, the little group I run, which is the Future of Work Consortium and the Hotspots movement, has half its clients in Asia. It's got administration in Boston. It's got the design done in Finland. It's got the head of projects working in the south of France. That's possible. And by the way, what that's beginning to tell us is that more and more of the value in your organization will be held in what Nokia and other companies are calling your ecosystem. And by that I mean all the talented people who are connected to you through joint ventures and supply chains. So globalization is on the march, but there's three other things that you need to think about. The one, of course, is demography, and we've already heard from Brian what's happening there, and I was interested to see that some of the differences you'd seen in age. You know, the big two stories on demography, and I'll show you the data in a second, are we're living longer. I was talking to the head of HR for Morrison's yesterday, and they said, you know, we've just done an analysis of our age population. They said we've got loads of people over 70 working for Morrison's, and we've got one person who's 96, full-time, 96. So, you know, it's funny, when we were in Singapore last year doing this, they talked about, we wrote a case about the, you know, how you deal with the aged population. And I don't know if you realize when people talk about the aging population, they're talking about people who are over 50. Now, for those of us who are over 50, and I'm certainly over 50, that's a little bit scary that we actually think, you know, that people are getting older when they're over 50. It's sort of a ridiculous notion. And the 96-year-old. Of course, the second demography is numbers. And the simple truth is, and those of you who saw The Economist last week, and I absolutely love The Economist, as a million other people do, I thought that last week they would run with the story about India and the games, the Commonwealth Games, because it's such a shambles. And I thought they'd lead with the fact they'd put a big front cover saying, India shambles. I don't know if you saw what they did last week. They put the front cover of The Economist was, India outpaces China. I thought, what the hell is that about? Actually, they were talking about demography. What they simply said was that actually China's one-child policy has reduced its population, India is still growing, and in a world, and this is an important point to make here, in a world where 5 billion people are connected and any intelligent person can get anything they need from the web with regard to learning, it begins to be a numbers game. And as the West ages, and the figures of this I'll show you in a moment are really scary, then, you know, India, who has a huge population and a huge consumer pool, is where the action is going to be, which is why last year when we asked each of our companies to nominate a part that they thought was future-proofed, you nominated India. And the work that Randstad's doing in India right now is really, really interesting. It's, what do they call it? Just incredible work that's happening there in the Indian group. Two other things I wanted to mention. One was society. That's really about trust. What's happening, and again, you see it in Brian's data, what's happening around the world, this is not a Western phenomena, is that the trust that you could have assumed between employees and individuals is now being reduced all around the world. And the final piece is carbon. One of the things that we do is we ask companies when they join our research to ask about 50 executives what they think are the big issues for the future. And we have a way of analysing that. And we include quite a lot on carbon. Carbon is an area that everybody thinks is important, but nobody knows who's supposed to be responsible for it. And it's a real challenge for those of you in HR, because I believe by 2025 it is the most important issue that you will face.